So we are going to talk about the Norma Basalis, right? So you have learned about the various normas, that is Norma Frontalis, the Norma Occipitalis, and the Norma Verticalis, and the Norma Lateralis. So what we are going to do is we will study about the Norma Basalis, which is actually the base of the skull, and it is slightly complicated. So we will try to make it as easy as possible. Okay, so as you can see, the Norma Basalis is a very uneven surface. It is very complicated structure. So in order to make it simpler, we will divide the Norma Basalis into three parts. From anterior to posterior, we divide it into three parts. And to divide it into three parts, we need two imaginary lines which we will draw horizontally so that the Norma Basalis gets divided into three parts. Okay, so let us see what are these three imaginary lines. Okay, so I have a pencil in my hand, and in the Norma Lateralis, you must have seen that here is the ramus of the mandible, and what is this? This notch here. Can you identify this notch? Anyone? So what I am doing is, this is the mandibular notch. So I am inserting a pencil in this mandibular notch, and this pencil is going to emerge from the opposite mandibular notch, right? So you can see this pencil has entered the mandibular notch from this side and it is exited from the other side. Okay, so basically that is the anterior imaginary line which we will draw. So that is the location of the anterior imaginary line. So everything anterior to it is the anterior part of the Norma Basalis. Okay, so to simplify it, let us look at the diagram. Right, so I hope this is visible, and am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I was showing you the anterior imaginary line, which is a pencil I have passed through the mandibular notch, right? So this pencil is passing through the two mandibular notches, and that everything anterior to this is the anterior part of the Norma Basalis. So basically, in this diagram of the Norma Basalis, we will, here is the mandibular notch. So this is the mandibular fossa, right? So the anterior imaginary line will be a line that will be drawn somewhere like this. Okay, so everything anterior to this line is the anterior part of the Norma Basalis. So we will start off looking at the anterior part of the Norma Basalis. So what exactly is this anterior part of the Norma Basalis? This you can see is the roof of the oral cavity, and the roof of the oral cavity is being formed by what? This part.
Palatine.
Right. This is known as the hard palate. Why is it known as the hard palate? Because it is composed of bones, and it is bounded by this arch. And this arch bears teeth. Which teeth? That is the maxillary teeth. So this arch here is known as the alveolar arch. Okay. So the upper teeth which are attached to the base or the inferior surface of the mandible form an arch, and this is the alveolar arch. In between the alveolar arch is a bony surface which forms the hard palate. Now this hard palate is composed of different bones. Okay. So first of all, let us label this structure here. This is the alveolar arch. By arch because it is somewhat rounded. Now these are pairs of bones. So when we look at the Norma Basalis, we have already divided the Norma Basalis into an anterior part, and we will also divide the rest of the Norma Basalis into a middle part and a posterior part. So we will have three parts. So in each part, to make things simpler for ourselves, what we will do, suppose we have identified the anterior part, so we will first identify the bones, then we will identify the sutures, and then we will identify any fissures or fossae or foramen. Right? So basically we have to identify what are the bony structures, then what are the sutures between those bones, then any fissures, any fossa is a depression, and any foramen is an opening, right? So basically we will identify these basic structures, and there can be some other special features, some other features. So when we are talking about the anterior part of the Norma Basalis, what are the bones that we need to identify? So we have already identified the alveolar arch, and the alveolar arch is part of the maxilla. Then this is the hard palate, and it is made up of an anterior 2/3 and a posterior 1/3, and these are separate bones. So the anterior 2/3 is made up of a pair of bones, and this bone here is the palatine process of which bone? Of maxilla.
Maxilla.
So the paired palatine processes of the maxilla. Posteriorly, this is a separate bone, and this is known as the horizontal plate. It is in the form of a plate, and this is of which bone? Of palatine bone. So basically, we have the alveolar arch of the maxilla. Then anteriorly, the 2/3 part of the hard palate is made up of the paired palatine processes of the maxilla, and posterior 1/3 are the paired horizontal plates of the palatine bone. So we have identified these bony structures. Now, obviously, because they are separate bones and they are joined together, so they will have some sutures in between them. Okay. So in the midline, we can see a median suture, right? So what name can we give? Because naming of the suturing, the sutures are very easy. We just have to name the bones. So this part of the suture, that is the median suture, is known as the intermaxillary suture, because these are parts of the maxilla bone. So this much here is the intermaxillary suture. So what will be the name of this suture? This much?
Interpalatine.
Interpalatine. Very good. So this is the intermaxillary suture and interpalatine suture. What will be the name of these two sutures? this much here, and this much here. So simply we can give the name palato-maxillary suture. Okay, so the left and right palato-maxillary suture, right? So intermaxillary, interpalatine, and palato-maxillary suture, and together we can see that they are forming a cross. They are crossing each other. So a midline or a median suture and a transverse suture, so they are crossing each other. So this total in totality is also known as cruciform. Cruciform suture. So I hope that is clear. That together all these sutures, they are known as the cruciform suture. Then most anteriorly, at the anterior end of this median suture is a depression. There is a fossa, and this fossa is directly related to these two teeth. What are these two teeth?
Incisors.
Medial incisors.
Incisors. So this fossa, therefore, is known as incisive fossa, because this is a depression just related to the incisors. So this is known as the incisive fossa, right? Now we have talked about the bones, we have talked about the sutures. There are not any fissures in the anterior part of the Norma Basalis. We have talked about the incisive fossa. Now let us see what are the various foramen. So the most important foramen in the anterior part of the Norma Basalis is the foramen that is present right here. Okay, just at the posterolateral angle of the palatine bone. One foramen here and its counterpart on the other side, right? So because this foramen is located in the palatine bone and it is slightly large, the aperture is slightly large, right? So I'll just name it. So this foramen here is the greater palatine foramen, right? It is a greater palatine foramen. So now, because there is a greater palatine, so obviously there should be some lesser palatine foramen. Okay, but instead of a single foramen, there are almost 2 to 3 small foramen here on each side, right? Just behind the greater palatine foramen, and they are present into this almost triangular projection of this palatine bone. This is the palatine bone. It has a posterolateral triangular projection like this. So this projection of the palatine bone is known as the pyramidal process. Pyramidal process of palatine bone. Right, this is the pyramidal process. This is slightly triangular projection of this palatine bone like this. Okay, and the lesser palatine foramen may be 2, or they may be 3, or it may be even singular. So the lesser palatine foramen are located on this pyramidal process. Okay, so let us name these. These are the lesser palatine foramen. So we have seen the greater palatine and the lesser palatine foramen. Also, there are a couple of foramen in the incisive fossa, and obviously, what will be the name of these foramen? Incisive foramen. Okay, they are simply known as incisive foramen. So they are usually paired, one on the left, one on the right. Okay, and they may even be median, one anterior and one posterior. But usually they are one on the left, one on the right. So these are known as incisive foramen. So these are the various foramen we need to identify in the anterior part of the Norma Basalis, right? So let us see a picture of this Norma Basalis. Okay, I hope this is visible.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we can identify the various bones first. Let us identify the bones. So what is this bone? This dark blue bone,
Maxilla.
that is the maxilla. Okay. Then this is the light blue bone which you have seen on the norma lateralis. This is a bone having certain projections, certain processes, triangular projections. This is the zygomatic bone. Okay. Then we have already identified this. These are the paired palatine bones.
Palatine.
Then when we come more posteriorly, this green bone, can anyone identify this green bone?
Vomer. Vomer.
Vomer.
Vomer, very good. So this is the vomer. Then what is this red bone?
Sphenoid.
Yes, this is a sphenoid having two wings. So this wing here is the greater wing of this sphenoid. Okay. Then this yellowish bone, very quick bone, that is the
Temporal.
temporal bone. Right. And finally, this is the occipital bone. And there is another bone that is visible here. That is the, can anyone identify this?
Parietal.
Parietal. This is the part of the parietal which is visible here. So can anyone identify or any other bone that is visible in this picture? Just take a look. Okay, I will come back to it slightly later. There is one more bone which is visible, which I have not labeled. So we'll come back to this picture. So what we have done is we have divided this Norma Basalis into three parts by these two imaginary lines. I hope you can see the lines.
So zygomatic
Yes,
process
sir.
of frontal bone.
Okay, I'll just come back to that. So here we have divided the Norma Basalis into three parts by the help of two imaginary lines. So side by side, what we will do, we will see the real skull with the image. So again, we have divided the skull into three parts. Okay. So this is how we have divided. So you can see the anterior imaginary line is passing just anterior to this depression, which is known as the mandibular fossa, where the head of the mandible articulates. Okay. And this anterior imaginary line is passing through certain structures. So what are these structures? So I'll just show you on the board once again. So the anterior imaginary line is passing like this, right? Before we identify the structures through which this anterior imaginary line is passing, in the picture that you just saw, there are two processes, vertical processes, which are descending from the sphenoid bone. So if you can visualize this, I don't know how clear it is, but in the center you can see the nasal aperture. Okay, so I'll just point out the nasal aperture here. That is the nasal aperture, and by binding the nasal aperture posteriorly. On each side are two plates. You can see these two plates, vertically running plates. Okay, so these are nothing but known as pterygoid plates. So two pterygoid plates on this side and two pterygoid plates on this side. So the lateral one will obviously be known as the lateral pterygoid plate, that is this plate, and here is the medial pterygoid plate. Okay, so there are two vertically running plate-like structures, a lateral pterygoid plate and a medial pterygoid plate on each side, and these are actually projections from the posterior part of the sphenoid bone, right? So when we look at the Norma Basalis, you can see the pterygoid plates on each side. So one confusion that we all have when we look at the picture. So these are the two ends of the pterygoid plates. So which of these is the superior one? Is this the superior one or is this the superior one? Is it superior or inferior?
Inferior.
So basically what is happening, this is the Norma Basalis and here is the pterygoid plate. Okay, this is the vertically running plate. This chalk is the pterygoid plate. So Norma Basalis obviously is like this in a real subject. So this part would be the upper end, this part would be the lower end. But when we see the Norma Basalis, we see the lower end towards ourselves. So that means this is the inferior end or the inferior margin and this is the superior end. Okay. So superior, this is the inferior and superior. So a lot of times we get confused and we call this as the superior one. Right. So this is the inferior end. So we have seen these are two plate-like structures on each side. The medial pterygoid plate, that is the medial plate, just at the base or the root of this medial pterygoid plate is a lacerated aperture, which you all know. What is this foramen?
Lacerum.
Foramen lacerum.
Lacerum. And at the root of the lateral pterygoid plate is another foramen which is oval. So what is that foramen?
Oval.
Foramen ovale.
Foramen ovale, like this. Okay. So now we can see that this anterior imaginary line is passing through foramen ovale, the root of the lateral pterygoid plate, foramen lacerum, the root of the medial pterygoid plate, and the junction between this part of the bone and this part of the bone. So anteriorly, this is the part of the sphenoid. Posteriorly, this is the part of the occipital bone. So anteriorly, this part is known as basi-sphenoid, and here this is known as basi-occiput. So this is the junction between the basi-sphenoid and the basi-occiput. Okay. So this anterior imaginary line is passing through the junction of these two bones. So they form a synchondrosis, right? So what are the structures from which the anterior imaginary line is passing? Foramen lacerum, root of the lateral pterygoid plate, foramen ovale, root of the lateral pterygoid plate, foramen lacerum, root of the medial pterygoid plate, and the junction between basi-sphenoid and basi-occiput. So let us get back to our picture that we were looking at. Right. So these were, you can clearly see the anterior imaginary line. It is passing through the foramen ovale and the roots of the two pterygoid plates and the foramen lacerum. Also, it passes roughly at the region of the junction of basi-sphenoid and basi-occiput. Okay. So we have identified these. These are the foramen ovale on each side. Similarly, we can identify the foramen ovale on the real skull. So I hope you all can identify the foramen ovale. Yes, so then these arrows are pointing to the next foramen that is located medially, which is the foramen lacerum. So both on the image and the real skull, you can identify the foramen lacerum. Okay, and obviously we have seen the roots of the two pterygoid plates. So these are the structures that are directly in the line of the anterior imaginary line. Okay. Now, when we talk about the posterior imaginary line, it passes through these foramen on each side, which are actually, this foramen is located in the midpoint between this spinous structure and this rounded projection of the temporal bone. So, can anyone identify this spine? This is the styloid process of the temporal bone. Okay, this is the styloid process which you have heard so many times in various lectures. This is the styloid process. Okay, so I'll just use a highlighter. So this here is the styloid process. And what is this rounded projection here? Mastoid process. That's very right. This is the mastoid process. So now you will be able to tell me the name of this foramen. So that is the stylomastoid foramen. Okay. So basically the posterior imaginary line is passing through this stylomastoid foramen on each side. Okay. Here you can see the stylomastoid foramen in the real skull. So this posterior imaginary line also passes through certain more structures, which we will talk about slightly later, right? So right now we are just concentrating on the anterior part. So this is the anterior part which we have seen, and obviously we'll just revise what are the various parts. So this is the alveolar arch, right? And then we saw the sutures. And before the sutures, we see this is the incisive fossa. Okay, this is the region of the incisive fossa having the incisive foramen. Then this is the intermaxillary suture. And here we have the interpalatine. Right, so this is the longitudinal median suture composed of anterior 2/3 intermaxillary and posterior 1/3 interpalatine. And then we have the palatomaxillary suture. So what are they together known as?
Cruciform.
Cruciform suture.
Okay, so that much is very simple. Then we saw this process of the palatine bone. This is the pyramidal process. Okay, this is the pyramidal process. Then we also saw certain foramen, and from this foramen there is some vessels coming out, right? So what was this large foramen here?
Greater palatine.
Right, this is the greater palatine foramen. So can anyone tell me what structures will emerge from this foramen?
Greater palatine nerve and vessels.
Right, so these will be the greater palatine nerve and vessels. Okay, right. Similarly, this will be the greater palatine foramen. There would be, and here you can see the foramen marked. Okay, here are the structures that are coming out. So obviously they will also come out from this side as well. I've only marked the foramen on this side and I've marked the structures on the other side. Then there will be some structures coming out from the foramen behind. So what are these foramen?
Lesser palatine foramen.
Lesser palatine foramen. So what would be emerging from the lesser palatine foramen?
Lesser palatine nerves and vessels.
Right. So there will be again a set of nerve and vessels that will be, we will not call them lesser palatine, we will call them the middle and posterior palatine nerves. Okay. Middle and post. If there are more than one foramen, then we can call it middle and posterior. Otherwise, we'll simply call them posterior palatine nerves. Okay. We will not call them lesser palatine nerves. We'll call them posterior palatine nerves. So this is the lesser palatine foramen. They may be either 2, 3, or they may be either single also. So here in this specimen, we can see a single lesser palatine foramen. Then this posterior part of the palatine bone is slightly, you can say it is forming a crest. That is, it is forming a bulge. So just at the posterior border of the palatine bone, just before the posterior border, there is a slight curved bulge in the palatine bone. And this is known as the palatine crest, okay, on each side. So I've just shown it on the right side, or you can call it the left side. So there is a palatine crest on each side of the palatine bone, just before the posterior margin or the posterior border. Okay, so this is the region of the palatine crest. And the two palatine bones, when they meet in the midline, posteriorly they project as a spine. And this is known as the posterior nasal spine. So if you can remember, in the Norma frontalis, we saw another spine at the base of the nasal aperture. That was the anterior nasal spine. So here is the anterior. Yeah, so this is the posterior nasal spine. Okay, right? So you just need to remember this part. So we are coming back to our initial picture, that is the line which is dividing the Norma Basalis into three parts, anterior and posterior imaginary lines. Again, we are zooming in on the part showing us the two pterygoid plates. So I hope you can see the two pterygoid plates on each side. So this here is the medial pterygoid plate, and this is the lateral pterygoid plate. Okay. So each plate will have a lateral surface and a medial surface. I hope you can understand this. These are vertical plates. So this is the medial surface of the medial pterygoid plate, and this is the medial surface of the lateral pterygoid plate. And what is this structure here? Can you identify this structure? That is the pyramidal process of which bone?
Palatine.
Palatine.
Okay, so now we are returning to the picture of the skull being divided into the three parts and zooming in on the anterior part. So here you can see the nasal aperture, that is the posterior nasal aperture, okay, on each side, and in the midline is the nasal septum. Okay, now what is this bone? Vomer. This is the midline bone which has two wings, and each of these two wings is resting on the sphenoid bone, and it's these wings are known as alae, or singular is ala. Okay, so this is the vomer bone, right? And I hope you can see the labeling as well.
Yes, sir.
Okay, then there are two openings associated with the medial pterygoid plate and the vomer, right? There are two openings. So one of these openings is known as the palatovaginal canal, and the other opening is known as vomerovaginal canal. So let us see how these openings are formed. These are very, very minute openings, right? Most usually they are not even visible on the actual skull, but theoretically you should know what are the palatovaginal canal and the vomerovaginal canals. So I'll just show you on the board. So I'll just cut this part. So basically, the vomer, I'm just drawing this part in a magnified view. So here is the vomer having a central vertical part and two wings. These are the alley or the ala of vomer, right? And the vomer is resting on which bone? That is the sphenoid bone. So here is the sphenoid, and this here is vomer, right? So this sphenoid bone sends out a process like this on each side. So this is the process of this sphenoid, right? And what is this bone? We already saw this is the palatine bone. So palatine bone is not simply a flat plate. It is a plate which is having a flat or a horizontal plate, a vertical plate, and again there is another process. So it is actually
Pyramidal.
in this shape like this. This is the horizontal plate which we are seeing here. Then there is a vertical plate and perpendicular plate which is adjoining this medial pterygoid plate. So this palatine bone will send a vertical part which is running medial to the medial pterygoid plate. So if here is the medial pterygoid plate like this is the medial pterygoid plate. Okay, I hope you can see. So the palatine bone, which is having a horizontal part, it sends a vertical part or a perpendicular part, and then again it turns like this. So this is the palatine bone, and here is the midline. Okay, this here is the palatine bone. So we saw that there are two openings related to the vomer in this region. One is known as the palatovaginal canal and the other is vomerovaginal canal. So that is known as the palatovaginal and vomerovaginal. Why? Because this projection of the bone, which is actually a part of the sphenoid bone, this projection here, it is known as the vaginal process. Vaginal process of which bone? Sphenoid. Okay, so you can see the vaginal process is adjoining the palatine bone on one side and it is adjoining the vomer or the wing of the vomer on the other side. So there is a gap between this process and the vomer, and there is another gap between this process and the palatine bone. So what would the name of this be? Between the palate and the vaginal process? Palatovaginal canal. And this gap between the vaginal process and the vomer, this would be vomerovaginal canal. So now is this clear? How the two canals are formed? Is this clear or not?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we come back to this picture of the skull. So anteriorly is the palatovaginal canal and more posteriorly is the vomerovaginal canal, right? And we can also make out another opening which is known as the pterygoid canal. And what runs in this pterygoid canal? Who will tell me?
Median nerve.
Median nerve, which is the combination of
Greater
Greater
petrosal
and
and
deeper
lesser
petrosal.
petrosal.
greater petrosal and
Deep
Deep
petrosal.
petrosal.
deep petrosal, not lesser petrosal. It is greater petrosal and deep petrosal. So now these are the locations of these openings. The red one is the palatovaginal canal, the blue one is the vomerovaginal canal, and this yellow one is the pterygoid canal. Okay, so these are usually not very easily visible on a skull, but at least you should have an idea where to look for them. So this is the picture showing us the formation of these canals, palatovaginal canal and vomerovaginal canal, right? Okay, so let's move forward. And these are the two plates, the pterygoid plates. So the medial one is the medial pterygoid plate, and the lateral one is the lateral pterygoid plate. Okay, so these pterygoid plates have a depression between them. Okay, so this depression is known as the pterygoid fossa. Okay, so the depression between these two plates is known as pterygoid fossa. And above here, actually this is the inferior end of the medial pterygoid plate. So this inferior end of the medial pterygoid plate is known as what? The pterygoid hamulus. Okay, this is known as the pterygoid hamulus. And this we have already seen, the triangular part projection of the palatine bone, that is the pyramidal process. Okay. Now this is the greater wing of the sphenoid, and you can see this oval shaped foramen, that is the foramen ovale, that is in the greater wing of this sphenoid. What is this bone? This is the petrous part of the temporal bone. It is the hardest part. That is the petrous part of the temporal bone. And what does it lodge? What is the constituent inside this bone? Anyone?
Jugular foramen and internal auditory meatus.
Okay, so internal auditory meatus is visible on this petrous bone, but the contents inside this bone are the middle ear and internal ear. So middle ear and internal ear are located inside this petrous part of the temporal bone. And this quadrangular plate, which is bounding the external auditory meatus, is known as the tympanic part of the temporal bone. Okay, so temporal bone has how many parts?
Four parts.
Four parts.
What are these four parts?
Squamous,
Petrous,
petromastoid,
Okay,
tympanic, and
squamous,
styloid.
right? Squamous part, petrous part, tympanic part, and the styloid process. So here, this part here, where is the mandibular fossa, the depression for the head of the mandible? This part is the part of the squamous temporal bone. Okay. So this here is a squamous part. This is the tympanic part. The green is the tympanic part, and the red is the petrous part. So I think we should stop here for today, and we will continue again in the second part.